My name is Michaela Keat, and I'm the chair of the Speakers Committee here at the college. I'd like to welcome all of you to our first speaker event of the winter term as part of the McKercher lecture series here at the college. As we gather today virtually, I acknowledge that I'm on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place, and we reaffirm our relationship with one another. This edition of the series, as I mentioned, is entirely online, and we have adjusted well to that. And I want to take a moment to thank the McKercher law firm for their continued support of the lecture series.
McKercher LLP has had the privilege of being a proud supporter of this lecture series since its start in 2014. The decision to support the College of Law in these lectures was an easy one for us, as we understand firsthand the great job that the college does in educating and preparing successful lawyers. Education, knowledge, and innovation are crucial in securing the future success of our province. Our support for this initiative provides a catalyst for provoking thought, enhancing collaboration, and engaging future leaders. With the transition of these lectures to the virtual format, we hope that this will provide an even greater opportunity for the College of Law to enlighten and engage students, lawyers, and our community on these important topics. Stay safe, be well, and enjoy.
About the event, about tonight's talk. The events unfolding to the south of us, events of the last few years, the last few months, and the last few days, can be analyzed and reflected on from so many angles. But tonight we've asked our guest, Paul, to comment on the role of law and the role of lawyers in the midst of all of this. So our speaker today is Paul Finkelman. Paul is currently the president at Gratz College in Pennsylvania. And we know him as a friend because he spent time on our faculty in 2016 as the Sallows Chair in Human Rights. He has a PhD in history from the University of Chicago. He was a fellow at Harvard Law School, and he has spent time in chair positions at quite a number of American and Canadian universities outside of our own. He's the author of more than 200 scholarly articles and the author or editor of more than 50 books. His most recent book, Supreme Injustice, Slavery in the Nation's Highest Court, was published by Harvard University Press in 2018. Paul, it's a pleasure to have you again with us tonight, and I'm now going to turn the mic, so to speak, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be back in Saskatoon. As I said, I wish it were in person. Someday it will be. I am sorry for the technology glitch. I would assume that this was caused by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security trying to prevent me from talking in Canada. But since, in case you haven't heard the news, the Secretary of Homeland Security resigned today, we can't blame at least him for doing this. And since this is not on Twitter, we can't blame his former boss. I was in Saskatchewan for the entire calendar year of 2016. And as a result of that, I was actually there when the last presidential election took place. And I distinctly remember giving a talk on the upcoming election and brazenly predicted that it would be impossible for the American people to elect Donald Trump president. I was, of course, wrong. I blame my mistake solely on the fact that I was in Canada the entire time and therefore not able to actually watch the election closely. In retrospect, one can easily see how this happened. I will start to go to the lecture that I want to give. I will stop talking about the previous election. Let me start talking about the issue of lawyers and the election crisis in America. I got an email from a cousin yesterday who said that he asked me if various lawyers could be disbarred or even jailed for what they've been doing. And He also wanted to know about Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and various members of Congress who are attorneys who have been acting the way they've been acting. And he wanted to know what the future was going to bring. And he ended the email by saying, "I'm asking for a friend who is considering moving to Canada." So that tells us something again about the crisis that is going on in the United States. It seems to me that in this current crisis, there are 7 categories of lawyers who have been involved in trying to prevent the American democracy, the American election system from working. The first category, the least bad group of lawyers, are those who are hired to bring cases based on believed evidence or sketchy evidence that there had been election fraud. The reality is every person who ran the elections, every state secretary, and in the United States, the elections are run on a state-by-state basis, but every secretary of state has said that these were clean elections. The president's own attorney general said there was no evidence of fraud. The president's director of election security said there was no evidence of fraud. So any law firm trying or willing to take on such a case could only have been doing it because they are willing to take a case that has no validity. For a very short time, a very big law firm based in Cleveland, Jones Day, apparently was representing the Trump administration in Pennsylvania, and immediately there were parodies on the internet attacking Jones Day. There were phony ads to come be a lawyer at Jones Day so you can subvert democracy and destroy the Constitution. And a couple of days later, Jones Day said they're having nothing to do with this, they're backing away. Clearly, reputable law firms were not going to touch these cases. One of the things that everyone has to understand is that while in a criminal context, everyone is entitled to an attorney, and in the United States at least, if you can't afford an attorney will be assigned to you, and if you are assigned to take a case in this context, you have to take it or have a good reason not to take it, even if you're not getting paid, because we believe that justice can only exist if people have attorneys. But that's criminal cases. None of the issues we're dealing with here involve criminal law. They are all about alleged election fraud, and the desire of people to prevent somebody from who was duly elected from taking office. So the first set of lawyers are lawyers who were initially hired and then backed away, and some of their firms may be damaged, but we don't need to worry about them. The second set of lawyers are lawyers who have been bringing one case after another, knowing that these cases have no merit, knowing that they cannot win, and in some cases, knowing that even if they do win what they claim they are trying to change, it won't change the election. For example, in the state of Pennsylvania, there were enormous numbers of mail-in ballots. Some of those ballots arrived after Election Day, but were postmarked before Election Day. There is one political reason for that, because the president's own postmaster general was sabotaging the post office, stopping the use of automatic sorting machinery, and moving mailboxes, eliminating mailboxes in some places. This was clearly an attempt to prevent mail-in votes from taking place. And so Pennsylvania said, if it's postmarked by Election Day, we're going to count it. So some lawyers went into court and said, you can't count election. You can't count Election Day ballots that are not that didn't get in on time.
Let me back up, and I am so sorry for all of these technological problems. Let me back up and start with the second category of lawyers. Lawyers who brought cases where they knew they would lose, or they knew that even if they won, it wouldn't matter. And the best example is in Pennsylvania, where some of Trump's lawyers argued that Pennsylvania should not count mail-in ballots that arrived after the date of the election, even if they were postmarked before the date of the election. This didn't go anywhere. It lost. But even if it had won, it would have changed so few votes that the lawyers themselves admitted that it would not change the outcome of the election. And so one has to ask the question in terms of ethics. And I think bar associations around the country have to ask these questions. If a lawyer knows that the case is basically bogus and knows that even if they somehow won the case, it would not affect the outcome, should the lawyer be sanctioned for bringing a case that has absolutely no merit? Now, as it turned out, every one of these cases was thrown out. Of the 60-odd cases, the Trump people won exactly one of them, and that was on a procedural issue, which they then lost substantively. So we have a series of lawyers around the country who have been bringing these cases. Why were they bringing them? And this gets to the whole issue of what we're talking about. They're bringing them because the President of the United States is a deeply disturbed individual. I think that's the only way to describe him. He is someone who cannot face losing. He does not understand that he is a loser. He has lost an election. And he is willing to do anything to undo the election, lie, steal, cheat. It doesn't matter to him as long as he wins. And he is surrounded by people who are willing to do his bidding, to humor him, perhaps either for political gain or financial gain, or to satisfy their own ego. But everyone who talked about this during the last 2 months has talked about the fact that they're trying to pacify this president, who, as we can see, is holed up in the White House, angry about the only thing he's done for the last month is pardon his friends who've committed crimes and play golf. But lawyers, respectable, self-respecting lawyers, should not have been taking these cases. The next set of lawyers are those who actually attempted to illegally influence the election. The most famous example, of course, was the call to the Secretary of State of Georgia, where Donald Trump pleaded, can't you find me 11,000 and whatever it was votes so I can win the state of Georgia? Now, the weird thing about this is that even if he won the state of Georgia, it would not have changed the outcome of the election, because he would have had to change the vote in at least 3 states to possibly win the election. But he was so desperate to win Georgia because he believed Georgia somehow belonged to him that he is essentially committing a crime by threatening and pleading with the election officials in Georgia to change the vote. Now, what's fascinating is there are, of course, a number of lawyers on the phone call with Trump. One of them is a woman named Cleta Mitchell, who I think is going to face some significant ethical issues down the road for her behavior in this phone call. Another one was a lawyer named Alex Kaufman, who was a member until a couple of days ago of the firm of Fox Rothschild, which is a Philadelphia-based firm. But Alex Kaufman and his partner and his father and one other person had a small Atlanta firm, and they had merged with Fox Rothschild, so they were Fox Rothschild's toehold in Atlanta. Alex Kaufman was on this telephone call with Donald Trump, supporting Donald Trump, and Alex Kaufman has now resigned from Fox Rothschild, as has his father. So this, again, is an example of what's going to happen to some lawyers for behaving in ways that are truly reprehensible because they are illegal. A fourth category of lawyers are those who have made bogus claims either in court or in public. One example of this was Sidney Powell, who again is, I think, somebody who's going to be facing a lot of litigation against herself. She argued that the Dominion voting machines, and of course, as I'm sure all of you know, Dominion began as a Canadian company, which I suppose is why it's called Dominion. She argued in court that the Dominion voting machines were altered to take votes away from Trump and give them to Biden. She further argued that they had been concocted by the late Hugo Chavez as though he were still alive and running Dominion. She spouted one conspiracy theory after another in court and outside of court. She is currently being sued by Dominion, and I am sure Dominion is going to win a significant amount of money from her, probably bankrupt her. She also spouted this on television, on talk shows. But of course, when she's on these television talk shows, she is in fact representing her client, Donald Trump. So even though she's not in court, she is obligated to follow the rules of a lawyer, which means that she is obligated to be honest and forthright and not lie and not make things up simply because it suits her purposes. Another lawyer who did the same thing, of course, is Rudy Giuliani. And Rudy Giuliani, I think, is again subject to both criminal and penalties and civil lawsuits by a number of entities and individuals for the lies he was spinning constantly on television and in court. Lawyers are not allowed to lie to courts. We know that. And they can be sanctioned for lying to courts. And I hope that when the dust all clears after January 20th, that a number of courts will bring cases against these lawyers for their misrepresentations in court, for their lying in court, and that bar associations will similarly bring sanctions against them for publicly lying about the cases that they are involved in. Lawyers can't make public speeches where they are lying. Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, Lynn Wood have all been involved in this in a variety of ways, as have some less well-known lawyers. Then we get, in the most recent few days, to lawyers publicly advocating violence. So that Rudy Giuliani is speaking to a large crowd in New York City, I'm sorry, a large crowd in Washington, D.C., right after Donald Trump has spoken. And he says that we should have trial by combat. This strikes me as an incitement to violence. It is a violation of his oath as a lawyer. A lawyer in the state of New York can be disbarred, as in most other states, for advocating the violent overthrow of the government. I just looked up one lawyer ethics rule, which says lawyers shall not make a statement that the lawyer knows to be false or with reckless disregard as to its truth or falsity concerning the qualifications or integrity of a judge, a judiciary officer, public legal officer, or a candidate for election or appointment for judicial or legal office. This would certainly include election officials in many, many states. So for a variety of reasons, the advocacy of violence in public simply goes even beyond this, because they are essentially advocating the violent overthrow of the United States government. Lynn Wood, a lawyer who has worked for Trump, at one point said that we need to execute Mike Pence. And in another speech, he said, get the firing squads ready. Pence goes first. Now, this is probably a federal felony, because it is a crime to threaten the president and vice president of the United States. And it strikes me that this man has done exactly that. More interesting is Congressman Morris Jackson Brooks of Alabama, who goes by the name Mo Brooks. Mo Brooks is a lawyer, and went to the University of Alabama Law School. And in a public speech, he says, "We are taking names and we should go kick ass." Now, when you're talking to a mob full of people who are very angry and violent, and some of whom are probably carrying weapons, it strikes me that this is, again, a threat on the vice president in the United States. And we saw the mob shortly thereafter invade the Capitol building where Mike Pence was running the Senate, because that's one of the vice president's jobs. And members of the mob were saying, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence." So I think Mo Brooks is coming very close to threatening the life of the vice president of the United States. And that in itself would be a federal felony. The news tonight is that the United States House of Representatives is going to censure Brooks. Censure within the context of the U.S. House of Representatives does not lead to a specific result. That is to say, he's not kicked out of the House. But what it does mean is that he will be called to the well of the House. He will have to stand in front of every member of the House of Representatives. And the charges against him, which a majority of the House have agreed to, will be read out, and he will have to listen to them. My suspicion is that he will not do this, that he will instead resign from the House of Representatives, throwing a small hissy fit when he does, and then he will go back to Alabama and run for his old seat and possibly win his old seat again. So that, again, raises the question, not only as a politician, but as a lawyer, do lawyer politicians have a special responsibility because lawyers are not allowed to recklessly disregard the truth? And they're not allowed to do this whether they are in court or whether they are not in court, whether they are defending or representing a client at the moment. As a lawyer, you are always a lawyer. And this is a message, of course, to all future law students. You are a lawyer, you are a member of the bar, and you have both a legal obligation, and I would say a moral obligation, a political obligation, a civic obligation to not publicly lie, to not publicly misrepresent the facts of things. And so I think that if the judges in Alabama had the requisite physiology of vertebrates, that is, if any of them had backbones, they would also move against Mo Brooks and disbar him for, in effect, advocating the violent overthrow of the government and, in effect, advocating killing of high government officials in the United States. Finally, and this ties into what I'm just saying, we have the question of lawyer politicians. Now, the U.S. Constitution prohibits any sanction for anything that a member of Congress, the House or the Senate, says on the floor of the House or Senate. So if you are a senator and you commit slander against someone else, you can't be sued for slander if you do it on the floor of the Senate or the floor of the House. You could, by the way, be sued for slander if you do it outside the confines of the House and Senate. And there is even a case where the person who printed the congressional record, that is the official printer of for the U.S. Congress, was successfully sued for slander because he printed the slander that another member of Congress had said on the floor. And what he should have done is not put that into the record because it was slanderous. And by putting it into print, he actually moved it from slander to libel, and he was successfully sued for libel. So the question becomes, what do we do with attorneys such as Brooks, Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, who have an obligation to tell the truth and have gotten up on the floor of the Senate and flagrantly lied about a significant legal matter. Nothing can be done to them, I think, in terms of their status as attorneys. But anything they did outside of the confines of that floor of the House or Senate, they could be sanctioned. So that if you notice the picture of Josh Hawley with his fist in the air, cheering on the mob as it's about to attack the Congress, one could argue that's inciting a riot. That is pushing the limits of what is speech in the United States beyond what is legitimate, and he could be sanctioned for these things. Do I expect any of this to happen? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how far members of Congress are willing to go to sanction their own. But it's clear, at least in the case of Mo Brooks, that he probably will be sanctioned for advocating violence, for telling people to go kick ass. So we have all of these phenomenally interesting cases. This last week and the last 2 months are a law professor's dream. We can have all kinds of final exam questions on the events that took place. I, listened to the tape of the conversation with Donald Trump, begging and pleading and then threatening and trying to coerce and effectively also offering a bribe to the Secretary of State of Georgia to go out and find him 11,000 plus votes so he can win. And I thought, you could give this transcript to a final exam as a final exam question in criminal law and ask the students to list all of the crimes that took place and all of the crimes by the different parties. But you'd probably have to give them like a 5-hour exam because it would take them that long to write up all of the crimes committed by Trump and the lawyers on his side as he is going through this. I am watching questions come in, and I think that what I want to do is shift to some of these questions. What about the concern of the police aiding and abetting the rioters? This, of course, is a significant problem for the United States right now. What do we do when those who are sworn to uphold the Constitution and defend the laws and defend the people and protect people instead join in the rioters? So as of this evening, 2 police who are part of the U.S. Capitol Police Force, which is a separate police force just there to protect the Capitol, that they have been suspended and that I think between 10 and 15 more are now under investigation. We've also discovered that a number of policemen from around the country took vacation time, flew to Washington to be part of these protests. I suspect many of them will be fired by their police chiefs. Again, some of this will be political. Perhaps if you are a policeman in Mo Brooks's Alabama district, you will not be sanctioned for having gone and rioted in Washington, D.C., but I suspect that policemen in many other parts of the country will find themselves looking for jobs after this is over. If we find that policemen actually committed crimes or helped the rioters, then I think it's likely that they're going to face criminal sanctions. Now, again, one of the dangers for people in the United States today is the fact that I think many of us are fearful that the sitting president will pardon all of these people. I could see him issuing a blanket pardon saying, I pardon anyone who has been arrested or charged with any crime connected to the events in Washington, D.C. that day. It's not clear if he has the power to do this, but he may very well. The pardon power in the United States is extremely broad. The only thing that the pardon power cannot be used for is to probably pardon oneself. I don't think Donald Trump can do that. or to pardon someone if it is because of a bribe or a payoff or some other illegal activity. Can the president pardon his own henchmen? I think it's clear that he can. No president in the past has done so. At the Constitutional Convention, there was a debate as to whether or not the presidential pardon should be broad enough to allow the president to pardon everyone. And one of the delegates to the convention said the president may himself be involved in a criminal activity. He may be involved in a coup against the United States, and can he pardon the other people who were involved in the coup? And basically the other delegates at the Constitutional Convention simply didn't think that was plausible. It was not reasonable. It could never happen. And look, it hasn't happened for 232 years. So that's a long time for it never to happen, but it conceivably could be happening in the next 9 days. We just don't know. One of the things that I find fascinating is that so many people have resigned from the Trump administration that if he tries to pardon people, I'm wondering who in the Trump administration is going to actually file the paperwork. And this leads to an interesting ethical question. If you were a Justice Department lawyer and the President of the United States says, I would like you to prepare the paperwork so I can sign a pardon for everybody who might have committed a crime and the attack on the Capitol, what if you don't do it? What would your sanction be? And I think the only sanction is, well, you could be fired, but hey, you're going to lose your job in 9 days anyways if you're a political appointee. And if you're a civil servant, you can drag it out for a while and you might not lose your job. So it would be very interesting to see whether he is able to pardon all of these people. And the other problem for Trump is that there are so many people that he's going to want to pardon that he just might not get around to pardoning all of the poor people who he misled into committing crimes against the United States. And by the way, these are serious crimes. These are felonies. The fool who broke into Nancy Pelosi's office and, of course, filmed himself sitting at her desk and then took a piece of stationery from her office and showed it to the cameraman outside and bragged about it. He doesn't understand that that's a felony and he could do serious time for this. So another question that somebody has asked is, can Trump legally pardon himself? No president has ever tried to do this, of course. It came up when Nixon was on his way out of office, and the Office of Legal Counsel within the Justice Department gave a memorandum opinion saying that the president cannot pardon himself. Question is, if Trump does pardon himself, how do you test it? The only way to test it would be to prosecute the president, and he would use as his defense, I have a presidential pardon, here it is, I know, I wrote it. And then you have a judge who says, well, I'm sorry, you can't pardon yourself, Mr. President. This goes forward. And then he appeals all the way to the Supreme Court. And it becomes a very interesting question whether you can get 5 justices on the Supreme Court to say that the president has the power to pardon himself. It would go against every notion of American law and, in a sense, go directly to the heart of Old English law because, of course, prosecutions in England were always brought in the name of the crown. So it is the crown versus so-and-so. It is Rex or Regina versus so-and-so, and these are the captions of the case. So the question is, can the president pardon himself? I would make the argument that one of the reasons the United States fought a revolution is so we would not have a king, because prosecutions in the United States are not brought against in the name of the president. They're brought in the name of the United States. So he can not, I think, pardon himself. I have a note here that says Senator Cotter has a question for me. I knew him before he was a senator, but if you have a question.
It's a question in three parts. The first part, I think, is for you. The second part for Craig Zawada, if Craig is willing to answer. Craig's a former president of the Law Society of Saskatchewan. And the third part is a question for Merlis Belcher, if Merlis is willing to answer. The first part is, can you talk about a little bit about, Paul, what happens, the process by which lawyers are held accountable in the U.S. and the role of the state bar and the role of state Supreme Courts, if the matters proceed in that respect? Let me describe the second question so Craig can think about it, which is if the scenarios that you describe were able to be proven in a context like Saskatchewan, Craig, what's your sense of what would happen to lawyers in Saskatchewan in the ways in which the Law Society would be held accountable? And then for Merlis, a larger question. I think of you, Merlis, as perhaps the most senior person on the line, and whether you have ever seen in your kind of wise history of your own life anything as unusual as has happened in the United States of late.
And by the way, this is precisely why you should never let a law professor ask a question, because he says, I have a three-part question. But by the way, how many points on the exam is each part of the question worth? So the answer would be this. There are local bar associations which don't have the power to take somebody's right to practice away, but can make your life miserable. The New York Bar Association is already moving to consider booting Rudy Giuliani from the New York Bar Association. And of course, this, given the fact that he was both the U.S. attorney in the Southern District and the mayor of the city of New York, this would be, of course, a great stain on his reputation, perhaps not as great a stain as the hair dye leaking out of his head on television. But by the way, if any of you like such things, there is a entertainer known as Randy Rainbow, and he just came out with a song called Rudolph the Leaky Lawyer, which I urge all of you to listen to if you have the time. It's on YouTube and available. But so Rudy Giuliani could be kicked out of the New York Bar Association. To be disbarred, somebody has to file a formal complaint, and there would be a disbarment process. I think that it is completely plausible that Giuliani would be disbarred, depending on the nature of the bar associations where Sidney Powell is a lawyer or where Lynn Woods is a lawyer. That the state Supreme Court or the ethics committee of the bar, as opposed to the bar association, will in fact move against these people. I think they have acted completely unethically. In addition to that, of course, it would be possible to file for sanctions by the defendant parties in all of the 60 cases that they brought, on the grounds that what they brought were frivolous cases. Now, since most of them were brought against particular states, it might be a little unseemly for the state of Pennsylvania to be filing for sanctions against Giuliani and Sidney Powell for suing the state of Pennsylvania. On the other hand, the Attorney General of Pennsylvania is a very upright and righteous person. He's also lives in the town that I live in, and is my neighbor. I suspect he will probably be our next governor, and he might very well decide to go for sanctions. So these are the opportunities. I don't imagine that the state of Texas would disbar Ted Cruz, although we don't know, because nothing like this has happened. We've never had a U.S. senator, in the case of both Hawley and Cruz, getting up on the Senate floor and flagrantly lying about the essence of American democracy, while a riot just after a riot has taken place, when there's literally been an invasion of Congress. And it may be that there are enough righteous people in Texas and Missouri to say to these two men that you are no longer fit to practice law in the United States. Now, they could say, well, we can't be questioned in another setting because we did this on the floor of Congress. Hawley, of course, put his fist up, not in the hall of Congress, and I think he was, in fact, fomenting a rebellion against the United States. He's the easier case. Cruz is a little shrewder or smarter than Hawley. So I hope this responds to your question, but now I can turn it over to my compatriots who can bail me out on these other two questions.
Well, I'll start. I hope people can hear me because good. And that's one mic that's working tonight, so that's good. Brent, I'll preface this by saying I'll put the emphasis on former president of the Law Society. So, and I'm not sure I ever spoke for the Law Society even when I was president, but a couple of comments, I guess. One is that there is, of course, a bit of a difference between the regulatory structure in New York State and the US and Canada. And of course, whereas the Bar Association might be censuring Giuliani, because of the division of powers between a Bar Association and the courts, it's slightly different than you have in Canada, where our Law Society is really just devoted to the public interest. And so we would look at it from that basis. What's in the public interest? And I, without naming any names or even saying that this would be what the Law Society here would say, I know just in terms of the discussions we have around quote unquote normal disciplinary matters, that they seem almost mundane compared to what's happening down in the US. And I can't imagine that there wouldn't be a huge outcry to be doing something, and that would extend to, even just talking amongst my bench or colleagues, not on just a have you seen this basis, nothing that's kind of dealing with the situation specifically, but everyone is just shaking their heads and saying, of course we would have to do something on this. So I expect that it would be a much different approach, but of course we don't have the same politicization of the bar and courts that we sometimes see in the U.S.
Thanks, Craig.
If I could just add a footnote to that, I'm trying to think of the last time that we saw this kind of behavior from elected members of the legislature in a democratic society, and I think it was 1933 in Germany. I mean, what we have seen is extraordinary by the standards of the Western world. Trump has managed to he always wants to be the best, and I think he's succeeded in this way about being the best at subverting all democratic values.
Good point, Paul. And Eric Klein makes the same observation in the chat line. Merlis, you've been around a while. Have you ever seen anything like this before? What's your sense?
No, I haven't. And I want to say, first of all, to Paul, or the professor, enjoying your conversation very much and your analysis. Very interesting. I'm a bit of a political junkie for sure. I guess I'd be called a Republican. In Canada, at least I'm of the conservative face. But there's a number of things that I think are unfolding here. One of them is what is most foremost to me, maybe the healing of the United States, or to try to bring calm to the United States, may or should possibly overshadow a lot of what's going on right now. What's going on right now with the impeachment and possibility, and trying to urge Mike Pence to move on the 28, I guess it is, the Article 28.
It's the 25th Amendment to
take
over, remove the president when he's incapacitated.
But I can't see that I don't think he's going to do that. But if I was Trump, what I would do now, I'd be concerned about my personal life and the lawsuits that are coming. And I've wondered about this for some time. So with a few days to go, should he make just a beautiful speech, just a very compelling speech, step aside, Mike Pence can take over, and then Mike Pence pardon him.
Well, so let me get to that. There've been a couple of chat questions about pardoning. So you saying if you were Trump, but of course, if you were Trump, you wouldn't be a member of the Conservative Party of Canada, because the Conservative Party of Canada, the Conservative Party of Canada is supportive of democratic values. And at one point, it was called the Progressive Conservatives. I don't know if it still is. Whereas I think the Republican Party is split right now between the regressive reactionary conservatives and the traditional conservatives. If you watch many Republicans, they are tearing their hair out. They don't have a party anymore. And there will probably be, in the next 4 years, a real reorganization and reckoning within the Republican Party. I don't know where traditional conservative Republicans who believe in balanced budgets, who believe in a strong military, who believe in honoring veterans rather than calling them suckers and losers because they died. The John McCains of the country, I don't know where they go. By the way, I think one reason why Trump lost Arizona is because, of course, he spent 4 years abusing the late Senator McCain, and Senator McCain was a very popular man in Arizona. And I suspect Trump lost, 10, 15,000 votes from people who have always voted Republican, but would not vote for somebody who defamed John McCain and said he was a loser. So you're not Donald Trump. But yes, if you were advising Donald Trump and he were willing to listen to rational advice, the rational advice would be that it is clear to me that I misunderstood the nature of the crowd that I was speaking to. He would never say it's his fault, but he could say, I misunderstood the crowd I was speaking to. And as a result of that, I think that the best thing for the United States is for me to admit that Joe Biden won the election, to concede the election, to congratulate President Biden, and to step down and let Vice President Pence take the reins for the next 9 days. Pence would undoubtedly pardon Trump because Pence would understand that this is be what's good, at least for the Republican Party and for himself, if not the nation. Biden would probably be thrilled if Pence pardoned Trump, because that stops the left of the Democratic Party from demanding that Trump be prosecuted for a myriad of felonies. I mean, again, you could teach an entire course on Donald Trump's felonies, and you would probably need 2 semesters. And so this would save Biden the problem. It would not, however, protect Trump from what he should be most afraid of, because the things he should be most afraid of are, one, his tax fraud issues with the Internal Revenue Service. And I'm not sure if a pardon can pardon him from taxes that he owes, but let's assume it can. He certainly has huge tax liabilities in New York State. He is undoubtedly going to be facing tax fraud prosecutions in New York for lying about everything under the sun, cheating, phony documents, claiming his daughter was his employee when she wasn't, or claiming she wasn't his employee when she was. I'm not sure which it is, but all of these things. She's in jeopardy. His son-in-law, Kushner, is in jeopardy. Probably both of his other sons are in jeopardy, all for financial matters in New York. Furthermore, and this is the real big one, if you followed Donald Trump's career, he has a long history of refusing to pay his debts, refusing to pay people he owes, and instead suing them or letting them sue him, because he could always.
Okay, so we've had another little interruption in Paul's audio. Paul, we'll just work on getting you back.
Am I back now?
Oh, you're back in.
Am I
Good
back
job. Okay, well,
Yeah, I was just told I was mean. So let me just finish this thought. But the one entity that Donald Trump is, the scariest thing to Donald Trump is that he owes unbelievable amounts of money to Deutsche Bank. And Deutsche Bank can afford more lawyers than Donald Trump can. And I think Donald Trump is going to be facing litigation for the rest of his life, in addition to libel suits, where he can't take the Fifth Amendment, he can't plead the Fifth. And so he's facing possible criminal violations in New York, possible criminal violations in Florida. The most interesting one, actually, of all of these is the newly elected district attorney of Fulton County, Georgia. Now, why does Fulton County, Georgia matter? Because that's where Atlanta is. That's where the Secretary of State of Georgia was sitting when Donald Trump committed a quite clear series of felonies trying to corrupt the Georgia election. Therefore, a prosecution of Donald Trump would not be from the Attorney General in Georgia. It would be from the county attorney where the crime took place. This happens to be an African-American woman who was elected in this, quote, fraudulent election. And I suspect that she is already beginning to write up the papers to bring an indictment against Trump and everybody else who was on that phone call from Trump's team, and drag them down to Georgia and prosecute them. Now, is this the best thing for the United States? I don't know. The best thing for the United States would be if he just disappeared. But I think these are things that are likely to happen. Again, the question is, do you allow a few 100,000 gun-toting neo-fascists, white supremacists, conspiracy lunatics to intimidate the rest of the country and say it is okay for somebody to commit as many crimes as Trump committed? So that would be my kind of long answer to your question. There are a couple of other questions that have come up which are fascinating. One is, what are the implications of the death of the officer during the commission of this criminal act? I'm not a criminal lawyer, but I'm guessing that the concept of felony. Do you have felony murder in Canada? Is that a crime in Canada? Felony murder is when somebody dies in the commission of a felony, and even though you did not commit the murder, you can be charged with murder. So if 4 people go into a grocery store to rob the owner, and the 5th guy sitting in the car outside running the engine, the 5th guy can be prosecuted for murder if they shoot the store owner while they're in there. I suspect that the death of the police officer at the Capitol would put hundreds of people in jeopardy of being prosecuted for felony murder. Now, would they be prosecuted? Probably not. Would we be able to convict them? It's not clear. But I sure wouldn't want to be one of those people who gets arrested and says, oh, by the way, we're charging you with felony murder of a police officer because you were at the scene of the riot. You were part of the riot in which he was killed. Would you like to instead testify against everybody you knew who was there? I mean, I think if there are no pardons, these are the kinds of cases you're going to have. And there are going to be a lot of Proud Boys. And I'm assuming you all know what the Proud Boys are. And I think they will be very proud of their orange jumpsuits. And they will be very proud of their striped shirts and pants when they get government-paid free vacations in concrete boxes for a while. So I think the murder of this police officer indeed raises the ante for everybody. The question is, if Trump is impeached, could Pence pardon him. The question, impeachment, of course, is the political equivalent of indictment. He still has to be convicted. And it's quite clear Mitch McConnell is not going to call the Senate back into session to have an impeachment trial in the next 9 days. So even if Trump is impeached, he will not be convicted. If Pence takes over because Trump resigns or Pence invokes the 25th Amendment, he could pardon Trump. That would be, that would be entirely plausible. Again, I think that that pardoning Trump would probably make Joe Biden's life a lot easier, and then he doesn't have to deal with the demands for prosecuting him, because before the attack on the Congress, Biden had said that he does not want to. He does not want to prosecute Trump. So I don't know. Someone has asked the question.
Paul, just as you're, I know you're about to read another question, but let me just step in for a moment. I just wanted to say that because we were a little late getting going, that we'll continue this dialogue for a little while longer. I understand if anyone needs to leave, please feel free to do that, but we'll keep the conversation going since we still have quite a number of interested people on the call. I do know that Brent has another question, so I might toss it over to Brent and just let him step in. And then we'll get back to the couple of more questions that are in the chat. So
okay,
Brent?
I just want you to know that I am happy to stay on as long as there are people who want to ask me questions. You should get your money's worth and not be cheated by technology. And if it doesn't work here, we can all turn to Twitter.
Thank you, President Finkelman. I wanted to just thank Craig and Merlis for their interventions and contributions. I say that partly, Craig and Merlis, because Mikhail is about to turn off your microphones, but so thank you very much. But secondly, I'm wondering, as I listen to Merlis and some of your observations, often the healing process for countries that are facing strains are often the contributors to that healing process are lawyers. In this case, to some significant extent, as you've highlighted, lawyers are part of the problem as opposed to the solution. And I'm interested in inviting Ken Coates, if you would be willing, Ken, as a non-lawyer, but who has a broad perspective on questions like this, to just observe on how does a country like the United States find the ways of knitting itself back together. And then, Paul, whether your sense of, say, Ken's observations has got some gravitas in the U.S. Ken, do you have a perspective on how does America find its way forward, and then see whether Paul thinks that that's a kind of a viable future?
So thanks very much, Brent, and a long time ago, and a great admirer of my friend Paul. So I enjoyed the.
It's good to see you, Ken.
Paul, I would tell you that I think America's got itself dug into a very big hole, and I'm going to challenge Paul a little bit by saying that I could talk about the leaders of that movement, which I frankly endorse, who went way overboard in their comment. Are sort of kind of ethically marginal questions and comments. I bring that up not because I want to sort of that particular issue, but to simply point out that America has got itself into serious division. I think some of the most severest divisions they've had in half a century, if not longer. And I don't see an easy path out for this right now, to be honest. Paul will know I've been teasing about this for a long time, that sanctimonious and self-righteous Canadians love to watch America go down the gurgler. We sort of sit back and watch what a crazy country doing all sorts of strange things, and I think that it's sad that we actually see it that way. But Brett, your main question is a really important one. does America get itself back out of a mess that it's dug itself into? My own version, Paul, and I really appreciate your thoughts on this, is I think the system's going to fragment into not just a two-party system, but perhaps into as much as a four-party system. People are going to find natural homes outside the Republican Party and to the more question. We have seen a disrespect, the like of which I've not seen in the country around the world for half a century. And really false talk. I think the Americans have gone really off the line. But they also went off the line in Portland. They also went off the line in Seattle. There's been examples of abuse of the legal process in so many different places. And when you have the president of the United States so willing to sort of throw himself overboard, and to be followed by many members of his own party, it is a serious problem. And I'm not sure how a country sort of gets itself back. In Canada, we've always had the Liberal Party and even the Conservative Party as the parties of the passionate middle, sort of doing the best they can to sort of hold the country together. And I don't see that middle there in America that's sort of healing and bringing those pieces together. So, Brett, I'm not sure if that's what you wanted me to say, but I certainly find the problems very serious, very systematic, and very deep. And I think the rhetoric on both sides is so extreme that when there's multiple sides, it's not a two-part process, that it's really hard to see how it gets knitted back together. And I think we're in for 4 very troubling years, if not longer.
Paul,
I heard about 80% of what Ken said, and at times he broke up, but I think I got the general gist of it. The first thing I would say is in an analytical sense, that whatever sort of rhetoric you have had from non-politicians, be they Black Lives Matter spokespeople or even some members of the more radical Trumpists, they are non-politicians. They are the people making noise, and we can either listen to them or not. But even in the most radical responses to what were nothing short of the murders of a number of African Americans by the police in the last 2 years, you did not have people saying, let's assassinate the governor of Michigan, which of course Trump supporters not only said, but actually were planning to do. They were discussing how to kidnap the governor of Michigan and try her and execute her. You certainly did not have any politicians above the level of what in England and maybe in Canada you'd refer to as a backbencher. So the Democratic Party has a few members of Congress who are very loud, very vociferous. They come from constituents where they probably cannot be defeated. AOC is probably the most, well-known one of them. She says a lot of dumb things, and she says some inflammatory things. She's not in a leadership position. She doesn't have any great power. She is a backbencher. You'll notice that she was given a spot at the Democratic convention this summer for about 2 minutes at a time when nobody probably was watching the convention. She got to say something and then she sat down. The Biden administration is about as middle of the road as any Canadian political party could muster. There is almost nobody in this administration that could be considered a radical. If you remember, for example, when Vice President Harris was running for president, the left of the party excoriated her because she had been a district attorney and an attorney general. And she was attacked for enforcing the law, for putting people in jail, for drug crimes. You will notice that Senator Klobuchar, who for a short time was a possible vice presidential candidate. Of course, she's in Minnesota, which is pretty close to Saskatchewan and borders Manitoba and Ontario. Amy Klobuchar was done in by the murder of George Floyd because it turned out that as a prosecutor, she had failed to prosecute the policeman who killed George Floyd. So in fact, in a sense, what Biden did was to take the most conservative of his opponents, Senator Harris, and make her vice president. Now, what makes her not conservative and what drives Donald Trump and his minions completely insane is, one, that she's female, two, that she's articulate and smart, and female, and three, that she's African American, although she's also South Asian American. So she's like a triple minority, and they cannot stand this. And this drives them crazy. So I do think it's important, at least from the perspective of lawyers and academics, to make the careful distinctions, because these are not equivalencies. There's no equivalencies. There is nothing that's gone on that's equivalent to telling a crowd essentially to have trial by combat and stop the Congress from voting on something. The last time the mob tried to stop the Congress from voting, the mob was led by Robert E. Lee, and he was defeated. This was truly an insurrection, and while the people who were in that mob would like to call themselves patriots and will talk all about Black Lives Matters and how, they broke the law in a particular city, they did this in a particular city. You'll notice that nothing compares to plotting the assassination of governors, calling for the hanging of the vice president. This is ratcheting it up to a very, very different level. Now, Ken's main point, of course, I completely agree with. The United States is in a big hole. We gave a giant steam shovel to a man who is pretty good at shoveling stuff, and he has dug us into a very, very big hole, and he has convinced large numbers of mostly very ignorant people that all kinds of terrible things have happened which have not happened, because they have been lied over and over again to. They've been lied by a man who is a brilliant liar. And of course, what makes somebody a great liar, as people in law know, is when you actually believe your own lies, you sound convincing. When you believe your own nonsense, you have no shame. And so this is a man who has no shame. This is a man who can say something and when questioned about it the next day says, I never said that. And when the film is shown that he said that, his response is, well, that's false news. That's fake news. I didn't say that. This is a man who doesn't know the difference between truth and falsehood, and has convinced large numbers of his followers that he is somehow beyond reproach. Now, here's the fascinating thing. Why have these people followed Donald Trump? Well, they followed Donald Trump because neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party for the past 30 years has catered to their needs in the ways that they think their needs should be catered to. So some of them have suffered from deindustrialization. Deindustrialization was going to happen no matter who was president. It happened under Republicans. It happened under Democrats. Donald Trump promised to bring back jobs. He didn't. He promised to bring back industrial jobs. He didn't. Why? Because those kinds of jobs in the current economic world aren't going to come back to the United States. And we as a society have failed to bring significant portions of America into the new economy. Now, in an earlier age, before there was an internet, before there was vast telecommunications, before interstate travel was easy and simple, the same people simply lived in their isolated worlds and nursed their grudges or didn't nurse their grudges and lived where they were, and the ambitious ones got out and went somewhere else. When I taught at the University of Akron in Ohio, and the great joke in Akron, Ohio always was, what's the largest city in the state of West Virginia? And it's Akron, Ohio, because so many people who had worked in coal mines that were closed moved to Akron to get out of West Virginia because there was nothing for them to do. The ones that stayed behind have suffered, and their children have suffered. And neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party has done much for them. Hillary Clinton certainly didn't when she campaigned. Donald Trump promised them something, and so they bought his promise because he promised that he was going to make America great again. He was going to bring their jobs back to them. He was going to bring coal back to them. It didn't happen. By the way, he also promised that he would, support fracking and oil. Well, how's that working in Saskatchewan or in North Dakota or in anywhere right now? It's not working very well because it's not a long-term solution to the problems. And in fact, when I lived in Saskatchewan, what impressed me about the province was that it had an incredibly diverse economy, unlike its neighbor to the west, which was entirely dependent on oil and suffers from the boom and bust cycle of oil. I lived in Texas for many years. Texas used to be entirely dependent on oil, and you could buy a house 1 year and sell it for 3 times the amount 3 years later, and then buy it back 2 years later for less than what you bought it for the first time because the price of oil went like this all the time. Well, Texas has now got a very diversified economy, and it isn't suffering from the boom-bust cycle. These are structural issues. These are big economic issues. Somebody has to tackle them. It would be nice if the people in Congress, Republicans, Democrats, would stop playing pathetic games and sit down and say how we're going to make things work. And by the way, there was a time when this happened. So in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, you could get collaboration among both parties to get things done that made a difference. We have since moved away from that. So I agree with Ken. The United States is in a hole, and I'm still wondering if I can get a job in Canada again. But I think we'll survive at least the next 4 years. Although it is not going to be easy.
Paul, I'm just going to step in for a moment, do a bit of a partial close. We want to keep the conversation going for those who want to hang in there. But I just want to take a moment, because I know that some folks are leaving or going to be leaving the call, just to express our gratitude for the audience and for our alumni and students and members of the legal community and the public who have joined us this evening. And I'll just invite Brent to step in and do a bit of a formal thank you. But then we will stay on the line here for people who have questions or comments that they still want to share. So over to you, Brent.
Thanks very much. And first, before referencing, if I can say the phrase, Mr. President, for your remarks, I want to also thank Craig and Merlis for their contributions, and Alexander Ferwada and Brian Pfefferly and Sarah Birmingham for offering their insights on Canadian criminal law in the chat function, and Eric Klein for his insights and other comments that have been provided. As many of you will know, Professor Finkelman, as he then was, served as a distinguished chair at the University of Saskatchewan's College of Law a few years ago, I think 1916-17, Paul, and it was a great...
It was actually the entire calendar year of 1916, so I watched the whole election take place.
That's right. And before we could actually communicate, I was observing to the others that the last time you gave a major speech, it was before the election, and you were about as wrong as it would be possible to be, as I recall. Wisely, this time waited until after the election so your predictions would be accurate. But having said that, your contributions to the law school then were fabulous, and this contribution to so many of us, as you could see, nearly 200 of us signing up to participate and listen. We're very grateful for the time you've taken and the insights you've provided. And I'm going to shut up and stop now. Thank Michaela as well as Katie for the work that they did in managing the technology, but then to invite others, if they are able to carry on the dialogue with you. And thanks very much for that generosity on your part. Thanks, Paul.
Well, thank you, and thank Michaela and Katie and everybody else. And it's good to see some of my friends like Ken's tonight. I will say this about the talk I gave in 2016. Hillary Clinton did beat Donald Trump in the popular vote by 3 million votes. So I wasn't entirely wrong in thinking that the majority of the American people could not stomach him. What I did not understand, and I think it's in part because I was not in the U.S. and not watching her campaign, is what an utterly abysmal campaign she ran, and what a self-righteous person she was, and how she was so unable to connect to anyone, and that she had never been somebody I wanted to see run for president. And the reason is because she doesn't like to campaign. She didn't like people. She didn't like to connect to people. She didn't like crowds. She liked people. She doesn't like crowds. So she failed to run a campaign, and so she lost. But no one would have imagined that losing the presidency would lead to the situation we're in now. One of the outstanding questions is you say that Trump cannot distinguish between truth and lies. Would he ever be found fit to stand trial? And I think the answer is yes. He does know right from wrong. He does know when he's breaking the law. He simply doesn't care, and he is willing to make it up and lie to protect himself when he breaks the law. He is not incompetent. He would not be incompetent to stand trial for anything. He simply is able to. The term in the United States we use is a grifter. He's a carnival showman. He's a guy who convinces you that you can win that stuffed animal if only you keep trying, and he's brilliant at it. But of course, there are other people who are to blame, including, by the way, the American media, because the American media adored him in the beginning because he was so colorful and so fun, and you could always put him on the news, and people would watch the news. The nation got suckered. So that's there's one other question that somebody's asked about him being banned from Twitter and whether this violates freedom of speech. And this is really a fascinating thing. The Republican Party has always stood for free enterprise. It stood for minimal government interference with business. And the Republican Party has always been the friend of big business and the opponent of almost any kind of regulation that would hurt big business. Well, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law, and through the 14th Amendment and Supreme Court decisions, we could read that as government shall make no law prohibiting freedom of speech. It doesn't say anything at all about private speech. I heard, one example is Senator Hawley had a contract with Simon & Schuster to publish a book, and Simon & Schuster has canceled his contract. Now, he is a graduate of Yale Law School. Presumably, he knows something about the First Amendment and about the Constitution. He is out there whining like a little crybaby that his First Amendment rights are being violated. He knows perfectly well that a corporate entity has no obligation to follow the First Amendment when it comes to decide what they should publish. They are making a business decision. They've decided their brand as a reputable publishing company would be irrevocably harmed by publishing the works of a person who just tried to overthrow the United States government and who is a liar and who is dishonest. And so they've made a business decision that they're not going to publish his book. They will probably have to pay him some amount of damages. And that's okay. That's how business works. But this is not a First Amendment issue. Same with Twitter. Furthermore, Twitter and Facebook and all of these entities have terms of service. They have contracts which say that you have to follow the terms of service. Trump, various other entities, the entire thing called Parler have violated the terms of service agreements over and over again because they are not allowed to advocate violence. They're not allowed to advocate hate. And the companies, the private companies, have the power to regulate who they sell their services to based on whether or not people violate the terms of service. The classic sign in an American restaurant is no shoes, no shirt, no service. So if you walk into a restaurant in your bathing trunks without shoes on, they'll say, sorry, we don't serve you. Go put a shirt on and put shoes on and come back. They can't discriminate against you for religion, for race, for ethnicity, for gender presentation. They can discriminate against you for violating the terms of service, which includes wearing a shirt. Same thing for Twitter or Facebook or any of these other entities. So there's no First Amendment issue here. And quite frankly, I find it gloriously amusing, to say the least, to listen to members of the Republican Party who have always opposed government regulation of business to now be complaining that a business is acting in its best interest and arguing that the government should come in and regulate these businesses because we can't get what we want otherwise. Are there other questions that I've missed? There's lots of wonderful chit chat here. And I have a thank you from Heather, and it's wonderful to see you again, Heather, as well. And to Doug. Is there any question that I'm missing? Oh, there was one I wanted to respond to. Somebody observed that I had not used the word fascism to describe Trump, even though in some ways I've obliquely compared him to what happened in Germany in 1933. My sense of Trump is, as an individual, that he is too lazy and too self-indulgent and too full of himself to want to bother to work hard enough to actually become a fascist dictator. That is, to become the dictator of a country, you actually have to work pretty hard at it. You have to dedicate yourself to it. One of the things that most fascist dictators had in common is that they weren't busy lining their pockets. They were very rarely chasing after women and assaulting them in public or private, and they weren't playing golf every other day. So I think Trump, at his heart, is a fascist, and I mean that very seriously. I don't use that term lightly. My college, Gratz College, has the only online PhD in the world in Holocaust and genocide studies. By the way, we have a number of Canadian students because we're online in our program. But I do not use the term fascist lightly because it's a significant term. But Trump certainly believes in the power of the individual, the strong leader, the great leader. That, by the way, makes him different, say, from a communist who believes in the power of the party and the power of the ideology. Trump's only ideology is Donald Trump. And what I find fascinating is that Donald Trump hung Mike Pence out to dry. He incited a crowd to charge the Senate where people were yelling, "Hang Mike Pence." And I think if people had grabbed him, they might very well have done that. They might have murdered him. Mike Pence has been the most loyal lapdog that any president could ever ask for as a vice president. And Mike Pence still does not have the guts to go to the rest of the cabinet and say, this man is unhinged. We need to temporarily remove him from office for the next 9 days because he is a threat to the world. He does have the nuclear codes. He does have access to arguably the strongest military on earth. He is completely erratic. He is completely unhinged when it comes to his temper tantrums. And, oh, by the way, he tried to get me murdered. And I think he should be removed from office. But, you know, as somebody just texted me, no way to treat a vice poodle. And that's exactly the point. But, you know, Mike Pence doesn't seem to be willing to even stand up for that.
There's one more question in the chat, Paul, from Gabriel, about changing the U.S. voting laws. Do you see that that question near the end?
Yeah, okay. So if Donald calls for changing the U.S. voting laws so that all states follow a federal voting law rather than each state making their own voting laws, would that be considered an example of communist action because it takes power away from the states? Well, I mean, that's part of the problem. Again, the Republican Party has, at least since the time of Ronald Reagan, has stood for what they call, you know, states' rights. They have stood for limited national government, return power to the states, let states decide things. But of course, in this election, they don't want the states to decide things because the states decided things in the way that harmed Trump. Democrats, since at least the 1930s, have been pushing for strong federal election laws to protect minority voters. By the way, in the 1890s, in the 1870s, the Republican Party, which was still the party of Lincoln and the anti-slavery party, was pushing for national voting rules to protect former slaves and their children and allow them to vote. So if in fact, you know, President Trump were somehow able to get a federal election laws passed, and if we had uniform voting machines and uniform voting systems, this would be probably lead to more voters and lead to less chance that somebody like Trump would get elected in the future. Again, I will say in the politics of this, that the policy of the Republican Party since at least the 1970s has been to suppress voter registration, to reduce voting, because Republicans note that it is very hard for a Republican to get a majority of the American voters to support them. Since Ronald Reagan, only George W. Bush in his second term, he is the only Republican to get a majority of the popular vote. George H.W. did not. W did not his first time. Donald Trump did not either time. So the majority of American voters are more likely to vote for Democrats, and the way around this is various attempts at voter suppression. I'll give you one sort of simple example of this. We just saw a runoff in Georgia. Now, this is a fascinating moment because Georgia has been at the heart of Southern opposition to civil rights, Southern opposition to equality. It was a solidly Democratic state when the Southern Democratic Party was segregationist, and then it became a solidly Republican state when the Democratic Party moved towards civil rights. And with the odd exception of Jimmy Carter, it has been a solidly Republican state for almost for 4 decades. There was a governor named Zell Miller who was a Democrat for a while and then became a Republican. It has been a very, very Republican state. And it has a funny senatorial election, unlike your senators who don't have to run for office. The senators in Georgia did. And in order to be elected, they actually have to have a majority of the vote. So in the presidential election, nobody got a majority, and for oddity, there were 2 Senate seats up. Usually, there's only one. There was a regular Senate seat up. Senator Perdue was up for re-election. Kelly Loeffler had been appointed to replace a senator who resigned because of health reasons, and she could only hold that office until the next election, and then she had to defend it. So you had 2 seats up for election. Between the November election and the runoff in January, thousands of new people registered to vote. Some of them because they had not been registered voters in the past, some of them because they turned 18 after the November election, but before the January election, and so they were allowed to register to vote. The Republican Party of Georgia went into court and tried to get all of these new registrants thrown out. Get rid of them, not let them vote. Say, if they didn't vote in November, they can't vote now, which of course violates Georgia election law. Why did they want to do this? Because they knew that most of these people were young people. Many of them were African American, and they weren't going to vote for their candidates. The result of the election is, a great shock. And so I will end with my attempt at a joke, which is a black guy and a Jewish guy walk into a bar in Georgia. Bartender looks at him and says, well, it'll be senators, because we have seen a political revolution in the state of Georgia. Georgia, by the way, was the scene of the lynching of a Jewish businessman 105 years ago. So this is sort of the resurrection, if you will, of liberty in Georgia. It's an astounding change. But the fact that the Republicans tried to prevent new registrants illustrates the problem. Donald Trump really doesn't want to have federal election laws. That will sink his party and his ideology. I don't, by the way, expect Donald Trump to ever run for office again. He doesn't like to lose. He doesn't play golf with people who beat him. So he will simply pretend that he wants to run for office because he can raise lots of money, and then he can spend that money on anything he wants. He's going to need it. I return the podium back to my handlers.
Thank you, Paul. Brent, is there anything you want to say in closing? I think we should probably wrap things up formally.
I'm just envious that we would be wrapping things up at a point when the participants drop below 100. Usually I hang in if the participants are above 10, Paul. So I want to just express
let's all go out and have a Molson's.
That's a good thought. And it's a thanks to you, but also A thanks to the 170 or 80 who started and the 88 of us who are still here. It's a compliment to you and a compliment to their interest in these eternal verities that we're wrestling with today.
And
Thanks.
thank you to the McKercher law firm for sponsoring me, and for my good friends and colleagues at USASC for inviting me back. I hope I see you all live when it's possible.
It's great that you're able to join us, Paul. And I just end on a personal note. I'm profoundly grateful that senators in Canada don't have to run for election. My chances would be non-existent. Thanks again. Thanks, Michaela.
Yes, and thanks
all.
to everyone
Thank you
for joining us as part of our community tonight. So have a good evening, everyone, and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Bye.